Welcome to the Art and Science of Joy podcast. This podcast is all about inspiring people to live more joyfully. So if you're seeking a bit more joy in your own life or seeking to bring some more joy to the lives of others, then this podcast could well be for you. And welcome to the Year of Joy series, in which I talk to experts on special powers, which we call Joy Superpowers. Each and every one of us can cultivate in order to build more joy into our lives. I'm Andrew Cannon, and I have the honor to be your host. And in this episode, I'm excited to be talking with Ryan Jenkins about the Joy Superpower of connection. Ryan is a best-selling author on the topics of team connection, generational differences, and the future of work. His latest book is Connectable: How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. And Ryan's thought leadership has been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, Fortune, and CNBC. Ryan has helped hundreds of world-leading organizations like Salesforce, Coca-Cola, and Delta Airlines, and is also partner of WorkRivet.com, a technology platform that facilitates meaningful one-on-one connections across multi-generational teams. Ryan lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with his wife, 3 children, and yellow Labrador, whose name we need to know.
His name is Bauer.
Oh, well, welcome, Bauer, and welcome, Ryan, to the podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Let's start with a bit of context, and let's talk about how you see the state of connectedness in America today. What's the state of the nation?
Yeah, before I give you some interesting data points, I'll take one step back further and tell you how I got interested in this topic. I'd studied generational differences for a decade, and I was writing a book about Gen Z or Gen Z, and that's the fastest growing generation in the workforce over the next decade across the globe. And I discovered that they're the most lonely and isolated generation we've ever encountered. They're actually twice as likely to experience loneliness than our elderly population. That's the first time we've had an emerging generation experience that more so than an elderly population. So highly concerning. And this was all pre-pandemic. So I dove into this work trying to figure out, how do we help Gen Z get more connected, especially as they're entering the workforce? And I zeroed in on the workplace being the place where we spend most of our waking hours. That'd be a great place to cultivate more connection to ultimately boost the well-being and the joy of this next generation as they come into the workforce. So that's how this all started. It turns out, we did a global research, and it turns out everyone's experiencing more disconnection and isolation. It still appears to be most acute amongst the emerging generation, but we're all experiencing this. And some of the data that we uncovered was that tripled is the amount of Americans who say they have no close friends since 1985. So that number's tripled. 0 is the most common response when asked, how many confidants do you have? So we just have smaller social circles. And then more specific to the workplace, 72% of global workers say that they experience loneliness at least monthly, with 55% saying at least weekly. And 69% of employees are looking for more connection at work. And so it's just fascinating how we're more disconnected than ever. We're looking towards the workplace to kind of fulfill this need. And it is just that detrimental. But back to your question on what is the state of connection, that's where we're at currently. We tend to, disconnection is growing. But there's a silver lining to this, in that because it is disconnection is increasing, that means it's malleable and it can decrease. And so we can actually find more joy if we turn the ship around as it relates to disconnection. And so I'm sure we'll talk about some ways to do just that.
We will indeed. And it's amazing. Let's pull you back to the comment on friendship and the importance of that, because that reminded me of the original research we did into joy and what sort of distinguishes people who are feeling a lot of joy in their lives and those who aren't. And the number of friends was a clear sort of denominator there. And sort of 5 tended to be the magic number that we came up with. If people could say that there are 5 people that they could call when they're in need, then you're likely to have a more joyful life than if you don't. But in your context of what you just said, it seems a lot of people are really going to struggle to name 5 people that they could call when they have a moment of need.
Yes, yeah, that number is shrinking, and it's really alarming. And I think one of the big reasons for this, we surveyed folks, and we identified 8 modern causes of disconnection and loneliness. But I think one of the big sneaky ones that no one's really thinking about is this idea of dependency shift. And so I'll give you a quick short story that kind of plays this out. But I have 3 young children, and when our youngest was about to turn 1, at least here in the US, when a child turns 1, you throw them this massive birthday party. I'm not sure why we do this, because they're not going to remember it, but you do it anyway. Right? It's for the parents, I think, right? And so we threw him this party. We invited over our college-age friend Cassidy to our home, and my wife and I were preparing the dishes before our guests arrived. And we handed a can of olives to Cassidy and said, "Hey, could you open up this can of olives?" She said, "Sure thing." My wife and I turned and began preparing some other dishes. A few minutes went by. We noticed no progress was being made with Cassidy's dish. We thought, oh no, well, let's investigate. And I investigated a little bit further, and she was on her phone. And I thought, oh my gosh, she just got here and she's already distracted by her device. I thought, I need to nudge her into some action here because we got guests coming over. And as I investigated further, it turns out she wasn't distracted, but she was on her phone, actually being very resourceful, because she was on YouTube watching a video on how to use a manual can opener. And it dawned on me in that moment, Andrew, and I'm sure listeners can relate, you and we are less dependent on each other than ever before. It's easier than ever to navigate this world alone. And that has not been true or easy in the years past, in the whole lifespan of humanity. And so we are less dependent on each other. So if something breaks in your home, you're less likely to knock on your neighbor's door and have that social interaction or call a parent or sibling. So there's just less of that. We turn to these wonderful devices that we have. And you and I were talking about AI before we hit record here. I mean, we should be using this technology, but let's not, we need to be careful, because the more we embrace this, the less that we're pulling away from each other. And it's detrimental to not only our physical health, but the health of our communities and our organizations. And of course, it's decreasing our joy as well.
Yeah, that is amazing. I didn't even think about that aspect of it until you just mentioned it. Reminded me of the time I managed to lock myself out of my car and found a good YouTube video that managed to get me out of that without costing me $200, which was a nice win. But thinking about it in the broader context, if all of our lives were just doing that and not talking to each other, not connecting, and especially intergenerational, I think, there used to be this whole thing of connecting with somebody who has experience, and, whether that was a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt or somebody not necessarily your parents, but somebody you could go and talk to. Hey, how do you do this? How does this work? Take you to see steam trains or whatever and see how these mechanics all work. And if we miss that totally, that I can imagine there is a detrimental impact on connectedness.
You're spot on. Yeah. For the first time ever, if you think about it, it's the first time ever we've ever had an emerging generation that has skills and knowledge that previous generations don't have, because we've always passed on knowledge and skills generation to generation to generation. But because of the dawn of the internet and all the mobile technology we have at our disposal, we have emerging generations that work differently, that communicate differently than previous generations. And that's causing differences and distance between groups of age groups. And you're right, that's contributing to the disconnection as well.
Which is really strange, because for those listeners who don't know, I live in Finland, and the home of Nokia. And Nokia's, slogan from sort of day one was connecting people. Right. So the whole premise of these devices when they came out, whether that was through text messaging back in the day or how that transformed, the whole premise was that these devices are going to help you connect. And now we're finding out perhaps that the opposite has happened. They're making us less connected, which is, I think, super fascinating from a sociological point of view.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, and well said. And the latest Apple conference that they did, where they just rolled out the new Apple, I believe it's called Pro Vision, which is Apple's, virtual reality headset. which is incredible, and just a phenomenal piece of tech. But they were asking Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, hey, tell us more about this tool. And he said the same thing that your folks did there in Finland. He said this is a tool of connection. Meanwhile, 90% of the images and videos they showed of people using the Pro Vision, they were all alone using that device. And I thought, that's not connection.
No,
it could be useful, but it's not connection. And I think you bring up a really important distinction here that we should talk about, and hopefully it's helpful for listeners, is that there's a very distinct difference between communication and connection. Those two things are not the same thing. So we use technology for communication, right? And everyone's has experienced this. You could text a significant other that you love them. You could text them that all day. That's just communication. And that's wonderful. And that's good. We need to be good communicators, but that's just communication. It doesn't become connection until they hear the tone in your voice when you express that sentiment, or they see your body language or feel your embrace. That becomes connection. So communication is the exchanging of information. We process that in the front part of our brain, and that's what technology is wonderful for. But connection is different, and it's processed in the back part of our brain, and it's the ease of communication. It's the sense of feeling seen and heard in a conversation. So how I like to sum it up is communication is dealt, but connection is felt. And we can't misconstrue these, because again, communication is important, but what we're doing when we're using technology, we're communicating and we think we're connecting, but we're not. And so we're essentially just social snacking, right? And we're keeping our loneliness and isolation and disconnection levels at a manageable level. But what we need as humans and as social creatures, we need nourishing conversations and connections to really fill our joy bucket, and to make sure that our health is staying where it should be, and that we're supporting one another. So there's a big distinction between communication and connection, and technologies filling that communication, but not connection.
Yeah, I love that. And I think for our listeners, that's something really important for everybody to take a moment to think about and to look at their own lives and how they're using the devices to, yes, help communication, but are they in the way of connectedness? And, next week I mentioned to you, Ryan, before we started, that we have Larissa Mills coming on to talk about balancing tech. And one of her things is about the dinner table and how those devices in that context are definitely hindering connectedness. As people are, busy doing their own social communications to 1,000 different people on 20 different platforms, they're ignoring that possibility to have that quality connectedness time over those family meals.
Yeah, I think we understand the importance of social connection. I'm convinced, after studying it for almost 4 years now, we don't know how important it is, and we take it for granted, and we think just being around each other is connection, but it's not. Loneliness is not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. Because you can be in a crowded room, and if you don't have connections with those people, you can still feel still isolated and disconnected and alone. So it's not about just the presence, it's about the connection we have between each other. And certainly these devices aren't good for that. And so we need to do a good job of keeping those devices in check. And the reason we created these devices was to serve us, humanity. And I think we use these tools for efficiencies. And so if it's creating more efficiencies, we should have more time. And I think we should be good stewards of that extra time to connect with each other, because it doesn't just happen naturally, right? We don't connect and build friendships just naturally. We have to work at it. And I think that's also why we're having such a struggle right now, is because it's so easy for humans to choose the convenient over connections, right? It's very easy to choose the convenient option, and we'll always do that. We'll choose the path of least resistance, but that's not the road to a joyful life. We need to be more intentional about building our connections and be careful of how those devices get in the way. So I'm really curious to see what Larissa brings, all the insights she brings next week.
Yeah, these are great. And I think, it's part of this, this isn't all about tech. I think there's also, a thing around entertainment that, people have somehow gone down the road of using entertainment as well as a surrogate for connectedness. And, that again is isolating in its impact. Yes, you could get immersed in a series. Yes, you could get immersed in entertainment. But again, is that detriment to your connectedness around that? So, and especially, I suppose, with the change in entertainment, I remember back in the day, obviously, when we had, just 3 channels and everybody watched Dallas, that at work, segueing into work, that would be the connection, right? Around the water cooler, what happened in Dallas this week, because everybody was on the same wavelength. Now we got somebody's watched the whole new series, somebody's on series 1, somebody's on series 10. So you can't necessarily even talk about your favorite series because you might be spoiling it for your colleague who is like 3 series behind you in the experience. So this lack of, I suppose, social experiences where we're all experiencing the same thing at the same time has become a personalized experience, which is maybe disconnecting. I don't know. You're the researcher. Tell me, what have you found in what's driving unconnectedness?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. You bring up such a great insight, and it's true. I mean, as consumers at an individual level, we want these unique experiences, right? I mean, if you and I went to Amazon or Netflix, we would have different experiences because it's catered to what our preference is. And of course, that's wonderful. I don't want to, scroll my social feed and then see advertisements that don't relate to me. I don't want to see advertisements for the Kansas City Chiefs when I'm a Denver Broncos fan, right? So we crave this individualized experience, which makes sense. But to your point, we got to be really careful because we're missing out on this collective social experience where we can begin to relate to one another. And it's getting harder to do that. I recently heard Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. I think it was Revisionist History, where he was highlighting, they were looking at Will and Grace, was like, they were arguing was one of the most, the last like kind of mass popular TV show here in the US, where it was, I think it got like a Nielsen score of like 9 or 10, which is just like incredible. And then they were contrasting that with one of the most popular Netflix shows, which was Orange is the New Black. And by all standards, it was a runaway hit, but it would have only gotten, if they still did the Nielsen ratings, would have only gotten like a 1 or a 2. And so to your point that it's gone are the days where we're all experiencing the same thing together, where that becomes a connection point. So again, that's even more encouragement and more of a nudge for us to get into communities and to be more intentional about sparking these connections, because it doesn't just happen naturally.
Right. So let's talk a bit more about your research and the science. When we think about, just to drive home to our listeners, that why is connection so important? What benefits? And then when you think about that, maybe also, if you look to this in the work context, how in particular in that context, the work from home whole thing going on, how is this all playing out? What's the benefits that people can have?
Yeah. So, we've only identified where loneliness shows up in our brain in the last like 8 years. So the science around how isolation and loneliness is impacting our physical well-being is really new. And so we're just on the cutting edge of trying to figure out and understanding more about how detrimental it is. But just to give you a couple of data points. So people who score in the top 10 percentile of happiness surveys do this one thing more than folks on the average happiness levels. And that one thing they do is spend time with others. So the most happiest of all people, what they do more so than anyone else is spend time with others. And then we also, in our book, we turned folks' attentions to the longest study of adult development ever conducted at Harvard University, where they studied at this point, they studied over 2,000 people. And they've done it for over 80 years, and it's still going on today, which is incredible. And what they do is that every other year they study in depth these participants, and they'll scan their brain and review their finances and do interviews with their close social ties. They'll do a physical check, and they found that, and the whole purpose of this study is to figure out what contributes to a long and healthy life. And what they've found after all 80 years, 2,000 plus participants, the definitive answer to a long and healthy life is quality connections with others. It's not diet. It's not exercise. Thank God from my perspective. It's not, economics, wealth. It's quality connections with others. So if our goal is to find more joy, whether that be in our personal lives or our professional lives, quality connections, it's all about our social connections. And so I can confidently say that the single greatest predictor of our health and our happiness, our joy, is the quality of our social connections. And so, yeah, I think, if you look at the data, it's really pretty clear. And then if you turn your attention more specifically to work, 69% of employees aren't satisfied with the opportunities for connection at work. And we're 7 times more likely to be disengaged if we feel disconnected at work. We're 3 times more likely to quit a job. And if we begin to understand connection, all this data really makes sense, because I'm convinced the most significant need you and I have is belonging, is connection with our fellow humans. Why? Because for as far back as we can recall, there was always strength in numbers. And as soon as you got excluded from a group, your survival rate plummeted. So now, even today in modern world, when you experience exclusion or isolation or loneliness, your body goes into that stress state. So your body's in this constant stress state. That's why it's so physically unhealthy for us. But when your body's in that stress state, you're in this constant fight or flight mode. So of course you're going to want to leave an organization if you're not feeling seen and heard and part of the team. Of course you're not going to be able to engage because you're trying to mend this invisible wound that you have. So I'm convinced that if we want to move the needle in our professional and personal lives, social connection is the thing we've got to dial in and really be focused on. So hopefully that was helpful. Threw a lot of data out there.
Absolutely. And absolutely. We love the art and science of joy. So we love the data as well. So that's fantastic. And, the quality word you kept repeating, right? Quality of connection, quality of connection, quality of connection. Don't think number of followers, number of likes, but think about depth of connection. But I'm confused. I must admit, I'm super confused, right? So 2 reasons. One is on a society level, a government level, is, we're hopefully led by smart people who hopefully look at the same data that you looked at. And we build a society where we're making people more isolated. We're pushing them into little boxes to live. We're disconnecting them from community. But also on a work level, if we just looked at the work level, and we've had this whole back to the office discussion going on. But it seems that companies, at least I haven't seen a lot of argumentation that connectedness is the reason for this. It's efficiency. We're going to control you. We're going to be able to, make you do more or whatever. But why aren't they playing the connectedness card? Do you know?
You're right. Yeah, no, I think there's very few examples of the organizations that we work with where we feel like they're doing it right, which is leaning into the benefits of connections. And they're really working to educate their teams that, hey, we're doing this for not only your physical well-being, but the health of our teams and our organizations. And so that takes time, that takes insight. And again, I think this is such a new conversation. And the science around this is also new. The data, we just came out of a pandemic. Like there's so much new studies that we're trying to unpack and understand. And so I think it's difficult for a lot of leaders and organizations to lean into this and take this from an awareness and education perspective to get folks back in. But really what's kind of what I think is happening here, that there's this pull between the 3 psychological nutrients that psychologists say humans have. So the first is connection, the second is autonomy, and the third is competency. And so those first 2 are at odds right now, right? We want our connection, right? We know we need social connection, but I'm convinced we don't know how much we need it, or we're the other thing to think about here is social fitness is a thing, right? That we need to be working out our social muscle, because if not, it atrophies, and then we're less likely to encounter and go into those social environments. So we need to be, of course, we know physical health is important. We know mental health is becoming more important. So mental fitness and keeping our brain sharp. The next category I think that we need to start thinking about is social fitness. How do we keep our social skills fit so that we can constantly be more apt and willing to step out of the house and outside of our remote work routine? So these are, the autonomy and connection are at odds, right? We want the autonomy. We don't want our organizations to tell us when and where we can work, because we worked from home. during the pandemic, we stress tested it, didn't break. So I still want my autonomy. So when organizations are trying to rip that autonomy from folks and telling them to be back in the office, that's why you see that resistance. Meanwhile, connection is just kind of flying in the wind, and we're not even really thinking about that, unless you're one of those few organizations I mentioned at the top of my comment here that are doing it strategically and with the education and arming their team members with the insights and the strategies they can do to cultivate more of this connection. And I will say too, last comment on this is that if you think back to that definition of loneliness, it's not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. So connection can still occur in a digital environment. It takes a lot more intentionality and it's harder to do, but it can still occur. And so, if organizations don't have to get everyone back in the room, in fact, some organizations we've been working with are just pulling everyone back in the room. But if they're not focused on cultivating that connection, it can exacerbate the isolation problem, because if you get in a room and you feel like, oh, my isolation and loneliness should now be evaporated, but if it's not, it can be accentuated and you can want to flee from those situations even more so. So it's a really complex and tricky issue here. And I don't know if that's hopefully that made you less confused on this topic there, Andrew.
Probably not. But I think it makes me understand how complex this issue is. Yeah. And to me, the issue is, again, in some ways it comes back to authenticity, that if the leaders are generally doing it from an idea that there are benefits to connectivity, of having people around the water cooler, of having people in face-to-face creativity sessions or whatever they're doing, of why are we in the office together, but it's just a question of, hey, we can control you better in the office, and therefore we want you feeling lonely sitting in your cubicle, rather than sitting at home where you might have the dog you could play with if you're feeling lonely. People are going to get exasperated. They're going to have a negative impact from that experience, because the desire that they had to have that human connection is just not there, even though they were given that opportunity to sit in the same canteen or whatever to that. So I think you're right. It needs to be, the behaviors need to change, because it's a feeling. I think you mentioned that as well, didn't you? It's that feeling of connectedness is what we're looking for here, and what people are struggling perhaps to find in that work environment. But I think there's hope. I mean, I know that there are a lot of companies like yours working to try and help leaders understand this issue and the impact, and to build that connectedness. So that's fantastic. Let's focus, we focused, I think, on the problem. We focused on the benefits. Let's focus a bit on the how, right? So, maybe some of our listeners are sitting there saying, oh, this is all very cool. There's a lot of good science coming here. Love this, love this, love this. But how do I go about building connection in my own life, whether that's outside of work, within work, as an individual? What's within my power? What can I do?
Yeah, terrific. I'll give a couple ideas. We talked a lot about technology and social media, and I'm sure Larissa in the following weeks will have a lot of great insights as well. But again, there was a difference between communication and connection. So how do you trade communication for connection? So where in those small moments in your day can you trade a text message for a phone call? Or can you trade a virtual meeting to an in-person meeting, right? Where can we make those small adjustments? Because they matter. And hopefully I made a compelling case as to why they matter. So find those ways to trade communication for connection. That's one idea. The other thing that gets, actually the number one thing that according to our research, that folks told us gets in their way of their connections with others is busyness. Research proves that time constraints severely limit our willingness to engage with others. And so, and we're all guilty of this, right? We're probably we have more on our plates. Our calendars are more jam-packed than they were just 5 years ago. And so we've got to find ways to create more margin, because it's in that margin that's where meaningful connections and meaningful relationships are made. So a simple idea is to arrive extra early, right? The next social media meetup or meeting or appointment you have, just show up 15 minutes early so you don't feel rushed. If you have a little bit of margin to connect with the person behind the counter, or to have a small conversation with a stranger. So just building a little bit extra margin can be helpful. On our team at Rivet, we have a connection tool that workplaces use to actually connect individuals that are scientifically proven to build a strong connection. And we're a company that's focused on connection, but we're all remote. And so we have a weekly meeting and we do something that we called Connect 5. So we spend 5 minutes at the top of our town hall meeting, are very busy, always plenty of things to discuss and go over, but we know we got to fit in the 5 minutes at the top to actually, where one person will share something non-work related. They'll show a picture that's non-work related. And so someone shared a picture of their marathon training. And we thought, oh my gosh, we never knew you were this extraordinary marathon, athlete. And so now there's a data point. We see the human behind the job. So that's another example, again, of putting pause on the busyness to actually cultivate that space and that margin to connect with someone else. The other thing I like to do at times, and I travel a lot, and I'm a busy person, and I tend to just get into my routines. But whenever I can, I try to defer to or spend my time saying after you. Right. If I'm going to the elevator with someone else, I'll pause and say, after you. Just spend the whole day saying after you, after you. Just a small, subtle way of kind of putting the brakes on the busy lifestyle and again creating a little bit of space to potentially have another connection with someone. And then this other idea that I like, again, this is kind of all around this idea of busyness, is how can we be more interruptible? I think so often we're always just focused on the immediate. And then if someone interrupts us, measure how you feel in that moment when you get interrupted. Are you all of a sudden very frustrated with that individual? Then that's a clear indicator that you might need some more margin. And we should not be angry about that. We should be able to turn our attention to those individuals that need our time and be in those moments, because those are great opportunities for connections. And so being more interruptible, we can't always be interruptible, but how can we weave in a little bit more interruptibility in our lives? And then the last idea I'll share is gratitude, right? Gratitude's been proven to lessen feelings of loneliness, because what happens when you're expressing gratitude, you're thinking about somebody else. You're outside of yourself thinking about somebody else. And that's essentially connecting with that other person. And you might not even have to actually be in the presence of that person to feel a little bit of a connection with that individual. So a daily gratitude journal or spending weekly, sending a note of gratitude to someone can go a long ways as well. So those are some ideas. And then I'll end my conversations around these tips and how-tos, is that it takes a lot less time and effort than folks think to cultivate a connection. In fact, according to research, it takes as little as 40 seconds to actually have two individuals feel seen and for loneliness to lessen during a two-person interaction. 40 seconds. And we've all experienced this, right? We've experienced to where, you spark up a short conversation in a 40-second elevator ride, and you both leave that elevator feeling a boosted well-being and more joy because you just spent a little bit of time seeing each other in that moment. So it doesn't take a lot. And I'll pause there. Hopefully that was some helpful tips there.
Absolutely. And as you know, over the next few weeks, we'll be diving deeper into this with our community members. But I think the thing that I've stepped away from this is to really, for me to take a moment now to reflect on my time and to really be honest with myself of where that time's going. And yes, busy, but how much of that is real busy and how much of that is self-generated in my control busyness, that I could take that 40 seconds and start a conversation with somebody in the supermarket or at the airport or whatever, and just foster that connection to them. And I'm a great believer in what goes around comes around. So I think the more you do that, you'll find that you will have a presence, an aura that people will then more likely to connect to you and offer you that gift of saying after you. Yes, because it's become part of your energy, part of your habit. So, I'd encourage people to keep pushing this altruism, this gratitude, as you say, and that will start coming back to them. And they'll find that people see this smile, whether it's an inner smile or an outside smile, and then they want to say, hey, how's your day really going? Not just ingenuously. So I think there's huge benefit to that. So thank you very much, Ryan, for sharing with us today. I always like to end with a question, very simple, but tell our listeners what's bringing you joy.
Outside of my wife and 3 kids and yellow Labrador, his name is Bauer, we covered at the top. They bring me enormous amounts of joy. I love connecting with them on a daily basis, but I just love having conversations like these and connecting with new friends like you, Andrew, and sharing this important information. And I hope this is helpful for listeners. So moments like these give me a lot of joy. And I'm hopeful that in the years to come, we'll all be a little bit more committed to connection, and big things are ahead when we do that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks once again, Ryan. It's been a pleasure and a joy chatting with you today. And I hope you, our listeners, have enjoyed this podcast episode as much as I have and feel inspired to cultivate more connectedness in your life. And please check out the show notes to the links to Ryan and all the great work that he and his team are doing. And if you're already a member of the Year of Joy community, over the next few weeks, we're going to be deep diving into connectedness and offering you some tools and tips to help you go out and try and embed more connectedness into your life. So meet us in the forum for that. And if you're not a member of the Year of Joy community, you are more than welcome to join. So please check out our website, theartandscienceofjoy.com, to find out more about that too. Thank you once again for listening, and I hope you tune in for the next episode of the Art and Science of Joy podcast. Until then, stay well, stay joyful, and stay connected.